Calaroga Shark Media.
September 7th, 1303. The most powerful man in medieval Europe lay dying in a filthy cell in the fortress of Anagni, 30 miles from Rome. Pope Boniface VIII, who had claimed that every human being was subject to papal authority, was the prisoner of King Philip IV's soldiers. His captors had beaten the 86-year-old pontiff, humiliated him before his own subjects, and destroyed his claims to supreme temporal power. The outrage of Anagni, as history would remember it, marked a turning point in papal authority. Never again would a pope seriously claim the right to depose kings or command the obedience of secular rulers. The man who declared himself the supreme judge of earthly princes had become their victim, proving that spiritual claims were worthless against military force. Yet Boniface was neither the first nor the last pope to experience imprisonment, kidnapping, or captivity at the hands of temporal rulers. Throughout papal history, the successors of St. Peter have found themselves at the mercy of those who recognize no authority higher than their own ambition. This is White Smoke, Episode 40, The Papal Prisoners. From Roman emperors to French revolutionaries, from Holy Roman emperors to Napoleon Bonaparte, secular powers have repeatedly demonstrated that papal claims to divine authority provide no protection against earthly violence when political interests are at stake. Today we examine the dark history of papal imprisonment, when the vicars of Christ became the prisoners of men who acknowledged no power above their own will. The vulnerability of papal authority to physical coercion had been established during the earliest centuries of Christianity, when Roman emperors routinely imprisoned, exiled, or executed bishops who challenged imperial religious policies. Yet the papal office itself seemed to acquire a kind of sacred immunity as the Roman Empire converted to Christianity and the Pope emerged as the premier religious authority in Western Europe. This immunity proved largely illusory when tested against determined opposition from secular rulers who possessed both the will and the means to use violence against papal persons. The medieval synthesis of spiritual and temporal authority that elevated papal claims also made popes more attractive targets for rulers seeking to legitimize their own power through control of religious authority. Pope Silverius became one of the earliest papal prisoners when Byzantine Emperor Justinian's general Belisarius arrested him in March 537 for allegedly corresponding with the Ostrogothic enemies of the Byzantine Empire. Silverius was deposed, exiled to a barren island, and starved to death, demonstrating that imperial power could dispose of papal authority as easily as any other form of political opposition. The precedent established by Silverius's fate would be repeated throughout the following centuries, whenever papal policies conflicted with imperial interests. Byzantine emperors routinely arrested, deposed, or exiled popes who opposed imperial religious policies, treating the Roman pontiff as merely another bishop subject to imperial authority. Pope Martin I suffered a particularly brutal captivity when Emperor Constans II had him arrested in 653 for opposing imperial religious policies. Martin was transported to Constantinople in chains, subjected to public humiliation, and imprisoned under conditions so harsh that his health was permanently destroyed. He died in exile in 655, a martyr to papal independence from imperial control. These early examples of papal imprisonment established patterns that would persist throughout medieval and modern history. Secular rulers discovered that controlling the Pope provided religious legitimacy for their political objectives, while neutralizing potential opposition from Catholic populations. The successor of St. Peter could be reduced to a propaganda tool through sufficient application of force. The transfer of imperial authority from Byzantine to Frankish rulers changed the context, but not the essential dynamics of papal vulnerability to secular coercion. Charlemagne's coronation as emperor in 800 created new opportunities for papal and imperial cooperation, but it also established precedents for imperial intervention in papal affairs when cooperation broke down. The investiture controversy of the 11th and 12th centuries saw both popes and emperors attempting to imprison or control their opponents through military force. When Pope Gregory VII excommunicated Emperor Henry IV, Henry responded by installing an anti-pope and besieging Gregory in the Castel Sant'Angelo until the pope died in exile. Henry's treatment of Gregory established the principle that papal spiritual weapons could be countered through temporal force applied with sufficient determination. The pope, who claimed the right to depose emperors, discovered that emperors possessed more effective means of deposing popes when political necessities demanded such extreme measures. The emergence of powerful national monarchies in the late medieval period created new threats to papal independence, as kings like Philip IV of France developed both the administrative capacity and the ideological justification for challenging papal authority within their territories. Philip's treatment of Pope Boniface VIII represented the most dramatic assertion of royal authority over papal claims in medieval history. When Boniface issued the bull Unam Sanctum, declaring that temporal authority was subject to spiritual power, Philip responded by sending soldiers to arrest the Pope and drag him before a French court on charges of heresy, simony, and sexual misconduct. The physical assault on Boniface at Anagni included not merely arrest, but personal humiliation designed to destroy the psychological foundations of papal authority. Contemporary accounts describe how Philip's representative Guillaume de Nogaret struck the Pope with an iron glove, demonstrating that even the person of the pontiff was not immune from violence when royal interests demanded such extreme measures. Boniface's death within weeks of his release from captivity was widely attributed to the shock and humiliation he had suffered during his imprisonment. The Pope, who had claimed supreme authority over temporal rulers, had been broken by the very forces he claimed to command, proving that spiritual authority provided no protection against determined opposition. The Avignon papacy that followed Boniface's death represented a form of collective papal imprisonment, as French kings maintained effective control over papal policy through their dominance of the papal court. The popes who resided in Avignon were not technically prisoners, but their dependence on French protection made them unable to exercise independent authority in opposition to French interests. The Great Western Schism created unprecedented opportunities for secular rulers to manipulate papal authority through threats of imprisonment or withdrawal of protection. With multiple claimants to the papal throne competing for recognition, kings could pressure their preferred candidate through various forms of coercion while maintaining the fiction of supporting legitimate papal authority. The conciliar movement that emerged during the Schism crisis established the principle that popes could be deposed by church councils when their conduct threatened church unity or moral authority. The Council of Constance's deposition of 3 competing papal claimants demonstrated that even legitimate popes could be removed from office when higher authorities determined such action was necessary. John XXIII, one of the deposed papal claimants, attempted to flee the Council of Constance in disguise, but was captured and imprisoned until he formally abdicated his claims to papal authority. His captivity established the precedent that popes could be held prisoner by church authorities themselves when their continued freedom threatened ecclesiastical stability. The Renaissance papacy's entanglement with Italian politics created new vulnerabilities to imprisonment, as popes became involved in military conflicts that exposed them to capture by enemy forces. The papal role as temporal rulers of the papal states made them legitimate military targets when their territories became battlefields in larger conflicts. Pope Clement VII's imprisonment during the sack of Rome in 1527 represented one of the most dramatic episodes of papal captivity in Renaissance history. When imperial forces captured Rome, Clement fled to the Castel Sant'Angelo, where he was besieged for months while his city was systematically destroyed around him. The psychological impact of Clement's imprisonment extended far beyond his personal suffering to affect papal authority throughout Europe. The Pope, who was reduced to a prisoner in his own capital, could hardly claim effective leadership over European Christianity. while his obvious powerlessness encouraged Protestant reformers who argued that papal claims were mere human pretensions. Napoleon's treatment of 2 successive popes represented the most systematic assault on papal independence in modern history. The imprisonment of Pius VI in French captivity and the subsequent kidnapping of Pius VII demonstrated that even post-revolutionary governments would use violence against papal persons when their political objectives required such measures. The deportation of Pius VII from Rome in 1809 marked the nadir of papal temporal authority, as the spiritual leader of European Catholicism was reduced to a comfortable but powerless prisoner, while French administrators seized control of the papal states. The Pope's 5-year captivity proved that spiritual authority provided no protection against military force when emperors possessed both the will and the means to exercise it. Pius VII's eventual release and restoration to papal authority did not restore the medieval synthesis of spiritual and temporal power that Napoleon's actions had permanently destroyed. The Pope who returned to Rome in 1814 ruled over a church that had learned the limitations of its claims to temporal authority through the bitter experience of imperial captivity. The Nazi occupation of Rome during World War II created the possibility that Pius XII might become the first pope to be imprisoned by totalitarian rather than monarchical authority. Hitler's forces surrounding Vatican City demonstrated that even the international recognition of papal sovereignty could not guarantee papal freedom when ideological conflicts reach sufficient intensity. The modern papacy's retreat from temporal claims while maintaining spiritual authority reflects lessons learned from centuries of papal imprisonment and humiliation. Popes who claim only religious leadership are less attractive targets for secular rulers seeking to legitimize their authority through control of religious institutions. Yet the history of papal imprisonment reveals fundamental tensions between spiritual claims and political realities that cannot be resolved through institutional arrangements alone. As long as popes claim moral authority over temporal affairs, they risk conflict with secular powers that recognize no authority higher than their own interests. The prisoner popes of history serve as permanent reminders that religious authority, however exalted its claims, remains vulnerable to those willing to use physical force without moral restraint. The successors of St. Peter, who found themselves in chains, demonstrated that spiritual power provides no protection against earthly violence when political necessities overcome religious scruples. The legacy of papal imprisonment extends beyond individual tragedies to illuminate the fundamental problem of authority in human society. The recurring pattern of papal captivity reveals how difficult it is to maintain moral authority in a world where power ultimately derives from the willingness to use violence against those who oppose it. Each imprisoned pope represents not merely personal suffering, but institutional failure to reconcile competing claims to legitimate authority. The spiritual power that should transcend temporal limitations repeatedly proves vulnerable to the very forces it claims to judge and guide. The prisoner popes remind us that even the highest religious authorities remain human beings, subject to the same vulnerabilities that affect all who claim to speak for higher powers in a world dominated by lower motives. White Smoke is a production of Calaroga Shark Media, portions of which were made with the help of AI narration, but still written and produced by real podcasters, Mark Francis and John McDermott.